In the year of 1991, a 36-year-old carpenter named Brian Kendall was living in the bustling city of Baltimore, Maryland. He was a highly skilled carpenter by trade, a dedicated husband, and a loving father. He and his wife, Belinda, were raising their two young children, Blair, who was about 5 years old, and Sean, who was just 3. Baltimore was a lively and fast-paced place to live, but over the years, the neighborhood they lived in started to feel less and less safe. The streets were busy, the noise was constant, and crime was beginning to rise. Brian and Belinda found themselves worrying constantly about their kids. They could not let young Blair or little Sean go outside to play in the yard without constant, direct supervision. The children felt cooped up, and the parents felt exhausted by the stress of urban living. Both Brian and Belinda had grown up in the beautiful, wide-open country of West Virginia, and they deeply missed that quiet, natural lifestyle. They wanted their children to experience the freedom of running through the green grass, climbing trees, and breathing clean country air without any fear. And so, they decided to make a massive change. They began looking for properties back in West Virginia, searching for a place that would offer them total peace and complete isolation from the modern world. Eventually, after weeks of searching, they found a home that seemed absolutely perfect. It was located in a tiny, unincorporated community called Slanesville, West Virginia. Slanesville was incredibly small, with a total population of only about 182 people at the time. The house itself was set deep within a dense, ancient forest, miles away from any main highways. It was a ranch-style house with a single floor, but it had the distinct, rustic feel of a log cabin. When you stood on the property, there were no neighbors, no other houses, and no city noises. Everywhere you looked, in every single direction, there was nothing but a massive, endless wall of green trees. It was completely isolated, but to Brian and Belinda, this was absolute paradise. They felt they had finally found a safe haven where their children could grow up in peace. Because the property was so far removed from society, they decided to get a dog to help protect their new home and watch over the kids. They went out and found a beautiful, friendly, and highly protective black Labrador retriever named Coco. Coco bonded with the family immediately. She was especially gentle with Blair and Sean, and she took her job as the family protector very seriously. Very quickly, the Kendalls settled into their new, quiet life in Slanesville, feeling incredibly happy and secure in their woodland sanctuary. Shortly after they unpacked all their belongings and settled in, Belinda decided to host a small housewarming gathering. She invited her brother, along with his wife and their young daughter, Jordan, to come visit and see the new house. Jordan was around the same age as Sean and had recently celebrated her birthday, so Belinda wanted to make the visit extra special. She bought a cake, some presents, and several bright, colorful helium balloons to throw an impromptu surprise birthday party for her young niece. The family had a wonderful afternoon laughing, eating cake, and catching up. After they finished eating, the adults stayed in the kitchen to drink coffee and talk, while the kids went into the adjacent living room to play. The living room was quite large and featured very high, vaulted ceilings. As the adults were chatting in the kitchen, they happened to look over into the living room, and they noticed something very strange happening with the balloons. The children had brought all the helium balloons into the living room, and they had floated up to the very top of the high ceiling, which was normal. But then, right before the adults' eyes, one of the balloons began to slowly descend. It did not drift down randomly as if it were losing helium. Instead, the string of the balloon was pulled completely taut, as if an invisible hand had grabbed the string and was actively pulling it straight down toward the floor. The adults stopped talking. A sudden silence fell over the kitchen as they all stared at this balloon. It was moving in a highly unnatural, deliberate way. The balloon descended until it stopped right in the middle of the room, hovering a few feet off the ground a short distance away from where the children were playing. The kids did not notice it at first. The parents stood frozen, watching the balloon silently, none of them knowing what to make of it. No one even spoke a word because they were so transfixed by the bizarre sight. Then, the balloon began to move horizontally across the living room. It glided slowly and smoothly, heading directly toward young Jordan. Jordan, who was only about 2 or 3 years old, turned and saw the balloon drifting toward her. She did not look scared at all. Instead, she looked up at the empty air right next to the balloon, smiled, and said, "Thank you," as if she were speaking directly to an invisible person standing right there in front of her. She reached out her tiny hand to take the string. But just as her fingers were about to close around it, the balloon suddenly shot straight back up to the ceiling, moving rapidly, as if whoever had been holding the string had suddenly let go. Jordan watched it go, shrugged her shoulders, and immediately went back to playing with her toys. The adults in the kitchen were completely startled. They could have rationalized a balloon drifting down due to a draft or a leak in the helium, but the way it moved horizontally, stopped, and then shot straight back up to the ceiling as if released by an invisible entity was completely unexplainable. They hurried into the living room, whispering to each other, asking if everyone else had just witnessed the exact same thing. They pulled the balloon down from the ceiling, examining it, trying to replicate the movement, but they could not. They walked over to young Jordan and asked her who she had been talking to just a moment ago when the balloon came down. Jordan, being so young, could not fully explain it in words. But when they asked her again, pointing to the empty space where the balloon had hovered, she stopped, thought about it for a second, and then pointed her finger into the empty corner of the room where absolutely no one was standing. She looked at them and simply said, "Him." The parents looked in the direction she was pointing, saw nothing, and then quickly broke out into nervous laughter. They told themselves they were just scaring themselves over nothing. They decided that the helium must have been slightly low, there must have been a draft from the heating vents, and since Jordan was only 3, she probably had an active imaginary friend. They agreed to drop the subject and forget about it. They spent the rest of the evening trying to move on, but after Jordan and her parents finally left, Belinda and Brian looked at each other and admitted that the entire incident was incredibly weird and deeply unsettling. A couple of days later, Brian had some free time. Because he had been working so much, he had not yet had a chance to explore the massive forest that surrounded their new property. He asked his daughter Blair if she wanted to go on an adventure with him to explore the woods behind their house. Blair was super excited to spend time with her dad, so the two of them walked out into the backyard and entered the thick tree line. They walked for quite a while, enjoying the quiet beauty of the forest, when they suddenly came to a stop. Right there, in the middle of the dense woods, they saw something that absolutely did not belong there. It was a large, charred, completely burnt-out vehicle. It looked like an old passenger van that had been engulfed in an incredibly intense fire at some point in the past. It was completely black, rusted, and reduced to nothing but a metal frame. What made it so strange was that they were deep in the forest, and there were absolutely no roads, dirt paths, or tire tracks anywhere near the vehicle. There was no logical way for a van to have been driven into this specific location. Brian, feeling a strange curiosity, walked up to the back of the burnt van and looked inside the rusted, open frame. What he saw sent a cold shiver down his spine. The interior of the van was filled with the burnt, melted remains of children's stuffed animals and toys. Resting in the back was also the large, rusted metal spring frame of a mattress that had been completely consumed by the fire. A heavy, sinking feeling washed over Brian. Every instinct in his body told him that this was not just a random piece of junk left in the woods. It felt incredibly dark and wrong. He immediately turned to Blair, grabbed her hand, and told her that they needed to leave right away. He told her not to look at it, and they hurried back to the house. When they got home, Brian told Belinda about the horrific discovery of the burnt van, the children's toys, and the mattress. Neither of them could make any sense of how it got there, or why anyone would burn a van filled with kids' toys deep in the isolated woods. Over the next few weeks, the reality of their new lifestyle began to set in, and it brought some major challenges. Brian was still working his carpentry job in Baltimore, Maryland. He tried to commute back and forth every single day, but the drive took hours each way. He was spending a massive portion of his day on the highway, getting almost no sleep, and he was becoming dangerously exhausted. It simply was not sustainable. Since the family only owned one vehicle, they had to make a difficult decision. They decided that Brian would drive the car to Baltimore on Monday morning, stay with his mother who lived in Maryland during the week, and then drive back to Slanesville on Friday night. This meant that every single week, from Monday to Friday, Belinda, Blair, and Sean would be completely alone in their isolated cabin in the deep woods with absolutely no vehicle and no way to leave the property in an emergency. However, because Belinda had grown up in a highly isolated forest home in West Virginia herself, she was very comfortable with this arrangement. She felt safe, especially with their protective dog, Coco, by their side. Ever since they had moved into the house, Blair had been begging her mother to let her go camping in their small RV camper, which was parked right outside the house on the edge of the property. She wanted to spend a night out there all by herself to feel like a real explorer. One week, while Brian was away in Maryland for work, Belinda finally decided to give in. The kids had been cooped up inside the house, and they were starting to get a bit of cabin fever. Belinda figured this would be a fun, harmless way to make Blair happy. She agreed to let Blair sleep in the camper for one night, but she set some strict rules. She told Blair that once she went inside the camper, she had to lock the door immediately and not open it for any reason. To make sure she was safe, Belinda sent Coco to sleep in the camper with her. Blair was absolutely thrilled with this setup. That evening, Blair went out to the camper carrying a lantern, some books, and wearing her warmest pajamas. Belinda went out with her, tucked her into the bed, gave her a kiss, and made sure Coco was settled on the floor. Then she stepped outside, locked the door, and went back to the main house. Inside the camper, the layout was quite simple. There was a large pull-out bed that took up almost the entire floor space. To Blair's right, as she lay down, was a large window with a heavy blackout curtain pulled tightly across it. At the foot of the bed, to her right, was the entry door, which had a small glass window near the top, but this window did not have a blind or a curtain to block the view. Blair turned off her lantern, snuggled under the warm covers with Coco lying right next to her, and quickly fell asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, Blair woke up suddenly. The camper was pitch black, but she could hear that Coco was acting very strange. The dog was highly tense, standing on the bed, staring intently at the glass window on the entry door. Coco was trembling and let out a low, uneasy whine. Blair sat up in the bed, trying to soothe the dog, petting her back and whispering to her to calm down. She looked through the unblocked window of the door. Outside, the yard was dimly illuminated by the pale light of the moon. As Blair watched, she saw a dark, solid figure walk slowly past the door, blocking the moonlight for a brief moment. She could not tell if it was a person, a large animal, or something else, but she was certain she had seen something move. Coco saw it too, and she immediately began to growl, a deep, menacing sound from the back of her throat. The dog's eyes followed the movement as the figure walked past the door and moved toward the side of the camper, right where the large window with the blackout curtain was located. Blair, trying to stay brave, convinced herself that it must be her mother. She thought maybe her mom had come outside to check on her. She turned on her lantern, crawled to the door, unlocked it, and pushed it open. She poked her head out into the cold night air and called out for her mother. There was no answer. The yard was completely still and silent. She looked over at the main house, which was just a short distance away, but all the lights were completely off. There was no sign that anyone had left the house. Feeling a sudden, sharp wave of fear, Blair quickly pulled her head back inside, slammed the camper door shut, locked it tight, and scrambled back onto the bed. The entire time she had been at the door, Coco had remained on the bed, her body completely rigid. The dog was now staring directly at the large side window, which was covered by the blackout curtain. Coco was baring her teeth, showing her sharp white fangs, and letting out a ferocious, aggressive growl at whatever was standing on the other side of that curtain. Blair was absolutely terrified. She dove under her covers, pulling them over her head, and tried to pull Coco down with her, but the dog refused to budge. Coco stood directly on top of her, guarding her body. Blair lay there, trembling in absolute terror until she eventually managed to drift back into a fitful sleep. Meanwhile, that very same night, a different kind of drama was unfolding inside the main house. Almost immediately after tucking Blair into the camper, Belinda had put 3-year-old Sean to bed in his bedroom. Sean was normally an incredible sleeper. Belinda could tuck him in, say goodnight, and he would sleep soundly until the next morning without making a sound. But on this night, things were very different. Belinda was lying in her bed, trying to sleep, when she heard her bedroom door creak open. It was Sean. He walked into her room, crying, and told her that he was scared and did not want to sleep in his room. Belinda got up, carried him back to his bed, tucked him in, and reassured him that there was nothing to worry about, that they were in a new house, and that he was completely safe. But over the next few hours, this happened 3 or 4 more times. It was completely out of character for Sean, and Belinda began to realize that something was truly bothering him. On the 4th time he came into her room, she sat him down and asked him what was going on and why he was so scared. Sean looked at her with wide, terrified eyes and said that there was a monster at his window. Belinda, trying to remain calm and logical, assumed that he must have seen a wild animal. Because the house was a single-story ranch home, all the bedroom windows were at ground level, right against the forest. She figured a deer, a raccoon, or some other woodland creature had walked past his window and startled him. She walked into his room, looked out the glass, but saw nothing but the dark, silent forest. She sat with him, explained that it was probably just a friendly deer looking for food, and managed to calm him down enough that he finally fell asleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Blair was incredibly relieved to see the warm sunlight shining through the camper window. She and Coco ran back into the main house, and they all sat down at the kitchen table for breakfast. Belinda, noticing how quiet Blair was being, asked her how her night of camping had gone. Blair, who was usually a very talkative, energetic young girl, remained silent, staring down at her food. Belinda asked if she had a good time and if she wanted to talk about it. Blair simply looked up, shook her head, and said that she did not think she ever wanted to go camping again. She refused to elaborate on what had happened. Belinda, not wanting to push her daughter, decided to drop the subject and let it go. The rest of the day went by without any strange incidents, and that night, Belinda put both children to bed in their respective rooms. They fell asleep quickly. Belinda went to her own bedroom, turned off the lights, and fell into a deep sleep. Sometime during the night, she began to have an incredibly vivid, strange dream. In her dream, she woke up and looked at the foot of her bed. Standing there was a young boy she had never seen before. He did not speak, but he waved his hand, signaling for her to get out of bed and follow him. In the dream, Belinda got up and followed the boy out of her bedroom, through the front door, and out onto the front yard. When she stepped outside, she was shocked to see that it was bright daylight. But their front yard looked completely different. There were long clotheslines strung up all over the yard in random, crisscrossing directions. Hanging from these lines were massive white bed sheets blowing in the wind. They blocked her view, creating a sort of labyrinth. She tried to follow the young boy, but she kept losing sight of him as she navigated through the hanging white sheets. Suddenly, she stopped because she felt a sharp, pinching sensation on her right big toe. She looked down.